Late autumn laid its weight on the bayou as if the season itself were a hand pressed over a mouth. The steamboat's paddle wheel slowed to a cough and then to a hush, its wake sliding outward in tired rings that did not bother the cypress knees or the mat of duckweed clinging to the surface like old velvet. Elias Morrow, a federal courier with the habit of reading every road's milepost as if it were scripture, stood at the rail and smelled ash. Not the heartening ash of hearths and kitchens, but the thin, medicinal bitterness carried after a fever has burned through a house. The pilot gestured with his chin toward the bank, toward a strand of grey powder strewn along the reeds as neatly as a lint on a black coat. Langridge, the pilot asked, though he knew, and Elias nodded because the map and the order in his satchel demanded it. No smoke lifted from the line of chimneys behind the trees. No fishing lines tensed over the water. A raft of coats shifted once and then went still again, their small bodies black buttons fastened to the stagnant green. The bell of a church rose above the cane and sycamore, the bell itself a dull coin against the sky, the rope that ought to hang from its mouth cut, a frayed stump like a hacked tendon. The pilot would not tie off at the rotting pier until Elias swore the government would honor any loss. Elias gave his word and the pilot swore in return that a man's word weighs less than a drop of rain in a storm. The boat kissed the pier and withdrew as though embarrassed to be seen here. Elias disembarked with his satchel and his ledgers and the stiff hat he wore when towns expected a federal seal. He swallowed the ash, felt it stick to the back of his tongue, and walked up the narrow path that the water had gnawed but not finished. The air on shore was warmer than the river's breath, and it carried the faint, sharp sting of sulfur, as if someone had set a match to a barrel of eggs and then blown it out. He paused at the parish boundary post, a plank of cypress burned with the name Langridge in clumsy letters that deepened into charcoal at their edges. A thing of pride made hurried, then scorched to penance. Nails flashed from the doors of the nearest cottages, bright heads hammered through crucifixes turned upside down. Bible leaves lay open and soggy under the dew, their lines from Revelation dark and patient, beasts and bulls and a number like a brand. His horse, tethered to the pier while the steamer pulled away, tried to follow when he whistled. The animal's ears pinned flat, and it danced aside, white-eyed and whispering through its nostrils as if the air itself hurt to breathe. Elias steadied the reins with a practiced hand, a stillness learned from years of delivering news to places that wished not to learn it. The horse put one hoof on the path, snatched it back, and kept its weight on the boards. Elias did not press. In every other parish the animal had trotted ahead without complaint, nosing laundry lines and apple barrels and curious children. Here, even the flies seemed to avoid the horse's eyes. The silence in Langridge was not the gentler kind that comes between sentences or after the final amen. It was a built thing, a hollow with walls. Elias felt it as clearly as he felt the satchel strap cutting his shoulder, felt it as a structure around him. A whole town had labored to erect this silence, he thought, the way men and women raised barns and churches. He knew the outlines of towns before he entered them, the mercantile facing the dock, a smithy a little way inland, a courthouse planted with the sort of optimism that dared any swamp to swallow it. He found those shapes, yes, but arranged as if by a hand that had laid them out and then left in the night. Chairs overturned at supper, a pot of blackened beans crusted to the sides of an iron kettle, the spoon still in place. A child's shoe half buried in the mud, its buttons single-eye looking back at him with no judgment at all. No voice. No dog. Even the leaves' friction seemed stifled, the cypress knees kept their knees. The rope beneath the church bell had not merely been cut. The end that dangled against the clapboard wall showed the twist of a knife blade, not the clean bite of a tool. Elias traced it with his thumb and came away with a smear of gray string and a smear of something else, lime, maybe. Turning, he noticed small mounds at the foot of several houses, a scatter of powder thrown there by hand. He had seen lime thrown on latrine pits and on bedding afterpocks. Here it was dusted across thresholds like flour for baking. The odor of sulfur strengthened the closer he walked to the church, undercut by a sweet, faint smell, the hovering ghost of flowers crushed in a book. He found the parish boundary marker again by another path, the way one finds the edge of a dream by stepping backward. The second post bore the same name and the same burning, but on its reverse someone had scratched a single line in a quick, domestic hand, "The hour has come." Elias looked out across the swamp. The bayou showed no wrinkle of wind. Spanish moss hung in linens from the oaks, and from a far-off stand of cane came a noise that might have been a man coughing and might have been a frog with an ambition to sermonize. He entered the first house and felt the air fold behind him as if he had pushed through linen hung to dry. There is a humility to the inside of a home left suddenly. It apologizes for the chairs, for the bread knife left on the table, for the apron hooked to a nail. The Bible sat open on the shelf as if left by a hand that would return any moment to continue its reading. He read a line and forgot it and read another, for he was a courier and his habit was to bring the proper word to the proper place. Outside, a drop of something fell and did not splash. The silence was a law and the town kept it. At the second house he found the same, a table abandoned in the motion of a meal, chairs tipped, a mug that had skidded and stopped at the table's edge, its glaze showed 10 ridges where a thumb had worried it raw over years of prayers said before breakfast. A bedsheet twisted on the floor as if it had tried to get up. In the corner near the hearth lay a ledger, its string undone, the columns bearing neat totals, nails, salt, candles, cotton by the pound. The last line in the last column read, "Only that and then nothing, debt absolved." The rest of the page opened into whiteness and waited there. Elias closed the ledger and replaced the string because such acts felt like breathing, felt like an anchor thrown against a bottom he could not see. The smell grew stranger near the center of town. It was as though the different airs, river, swamp, human habitation, had been mixed in a bowl and poured back wrong. He passed a window whose panes had been papered over with scriptural scraps. He lifted one and found, not the clear day behind it, but additional paper, layered and pinned with children's dress pins. Behind the paper, the faintest imprint of a hand, as if some child had set her palm against the sheet and traced around it, and then no one had thought to turn the page and praise her steadiness. At the church door he paused until the muscles behind his knees seemed to turn to wax and run. The doors were not merely open, they had been propped with hymnals as if open were their natural state. Inside, the nave was sluggish with heat. Flies would not cross the threshold. The pews faced the pulpit with the obedience of an army, and the pulpit itself bore a stack of record books, the parish ledgers that towns maintain when they believe themselves worth recording. Elias had seen such books in dozens of places, births and baptisms, marriages and tithe receipts, deaths that required a signature to become real. He took the top ledger carefully. The leather peeled under his fingers, and the first page recognized him not at all. He turned to the back. The hand that had written there favored the same angle and the same flourishes page after page. Catherine Baird, Clerk of Records, the signature read, in a confidence that would have reassured anyone that there was an order to keep. Births had been entered with a prim joy, marriages with a straight mouth, deaths with the slight weight of ink that a steady hand cannot help but use when it knows its task matters. Then the columns broke. The dates refused to run forward in a single row, but doubled back, repeated themselves as if time had slipped on algae and fallen, tried to stand, fallen again. Whole households were crossed with a diagonal line of ink that cut through names and did not care about surnames' pride. A note in a narrow margin read, "The fever speaks in Scripture. We are obedient because obedience kept us alive when the water rose, we are obedient again." Elias let the page fall against the others and stared up into the rafters where swallows had built their nests. The birds were gone, but their empty rooms remained, their cups of mud clinging with faith. Outside the church, he found a shoe's twin, the other small shoe, set carefully on the step as if to say, "Here is what goes in pairs, even when pairs are broken." He set the shoes side by side without knowing why, and it felt somehow like blasphemy to make order where the town had chosen to unmake it. He walked the lanes that any parish draws by instinct, one to the mill, one to the fields, one stubborn track to the place where river and land argue. The stubborn track led to a low platform erected for the hanging of bells and notices. Its post held no notice, only a rectangle of cleaner wood where one had been ripped away. The iron staples that had held it were bent like fingers that had lost an argument. In the mud below, beneath the fallen leaves, he discovered a slimmer staple still clinging to a shred of paper. He teased it free, on that shred, signed the certificates. That was all. The paper smelled of chapel air and ink that wanted to be fresh. He led the horse at last as far as it would come. The animal balked at the first crucifix, turned wrong and threw its weight backward in refusal. Elias stood for a long while with his palm against the horse's neck and listened to their two breaths cross and recross each other. A town, he thought, is not a set of buildings. It is a collection of acts repeated until the acts cannot be distinguished from prayers. Here, the acts had stopped mid-prayer. The lids of flour barrels sat askew. A jar of pears in syrup had burst and sunk into itself. The cane beyond the last house shivered once in a wind that did not touch his coat. He spoke aloud then, quietly, because a man alone in a maid's silence must make a sentence to hear another human thing. Morrow, Elias, he said, a ridiculous introduction to no one, and he felt a little steadier hearing the name he carried spelled out where a wall could hold it. He said, courier, federal, as if to excuse his presence or declare that the weight of his satchel allowed him to be where he should not. For answer, a plop from the bayou's edge like a fish turning lazily in its sleep, and after that a faint tick from a parlor clock that made a single step and stood still, a clock that had resolved, perhaps, to stop at midnight and keep faith with its neighbors. He opened another house. The wallpaper here bore sprays of faded violets. The parlor held a secretary desk, its pigeonholes fat with notes, and on the blotter a quill lay as if just set down. He touched its feathers. The shaft snapped at a place where it had already cracked, the way a limb breaks along a grain of rot. Under the blotter he discovered a second ledger, smaller, meant for lists, trades with the peddler boat, sacks of rice owed to Mrs. Blaine, a note that the preacher's wife had returned 2 loaves she could not eat. In the ledger's gutter, a grain of salt had lodged and refused to fall out. He tasted it without thinking and found it bitter, not like sea salt, but like a mixture doctors pinched into water when they meant to clean a thing too thoroughly. He came at last to the courthouse, a simple box of weathered board set a little above the rest as if its floor were entitled to cleaner air. The double doors were open not in welcome but in conviction. Dust rode the light down and hung in its own certainty. The bench where a magistrate would sit had been polished by generations of Sunday coats, the rail that separated the people from the law bore scratches where impatient rings had worried it. On the table lay a sheaf of loose pages weighted by a stone. Elias lifted the stone and saw the top page was a letter begun and abandoned, to the office in Baton Rouge, I write to report that we are, the line broke there. The next page bore the same hand and continued, but with a lurch, we are being measured. No signature. In the corner of the room a bucket of lime leaned open, as if someone had been working with it and then stopped in the middle of the arc. He walked out into the yard and heard the far-off rattle of a heron lifting from the reeds, its wings like sheets shaken loose. The sun had fallen to that low posture it takes when the day's decisions have all been made and there remains only the accounting. A sound came then, small and stupidly ordinary, so ordinary that it startled him, the slight nudge of a door working on its hinges under its own weight as the air thickened with evening. The door closed itself, and the click carried up the lane and into the church and up to the bell that, rope or no rope, echoed the click with the thinnest memory of a toll. He did not find bodies. He did not find the ordinary wreckage violence leaves, scattered plates, dragged chairs, the stubborn little streaks that men pretend not to see. He found instead a cleanliness that had been thrown over the town like a sheet. He found lists interrupted, prayers laid open and held down by domestic objects, a thimble, a spoon, a child's practice of a letter on slate, the hook of the J left unfinished. He found, in a cabbage patch behind a cottage, a sprig of rosemary tied with thread, as if herbs could bind a happening to a smaller size. He found at the edge of the water not footprints to boards but boards to water, where someone had taken the time to wash away steps with a broom made of cane. He found a calmness that did not mean peace. He set his satchel on the courthouse table and wrote his first sentence because he must, arrived Langridge Parish at the hour of 4 in the afternoon, found the town without speech and without smoke. He blotted the line and realized his hand trembled not from fear but from the effort of writing a thing that wanted not to be written. He set down his pen and listened. The swamp made no ordinary swamp noise. He heard not the constant talk of frogs but an arrangement of quiets like a harmony composed by lac. The sulphur bit his eyes and then receded, and in its place came the faintest hint of candle grease, the smell churches keep even after their doors have been open all day. He stood, uncertain whether to move toward the church again, or the houses, or the dock where his horse stood with its head low as if ashamed of its fear. In the low light the ash along the bank gleamed faintly as if stirred by a breath that was not wind. The ledgers on the church altar waited. The bell did not ring. The hour had come, the post had said, and the hour refused to leave. He thought of the kind of town that signs its own deaths. He thought of the handwriting of a clerk who learns to make a line steady regardless of the word she must enter. He thought of men who turn crosses upside down not to mock a faith, but to say the faith had stepped outside and would return when asked. He thought of lime, the white coat thrown over a memory, and of pages that hold the last warmth of a hand for hours. Night dropped its dark mosquito net over the parish, and Elias felt the first coolness since he had stepped ashore. The coolness brought with it a map of gooseflesh along his forearms, and he took it as the body's own vote. He gathered his satchel and extinguished nothing because nothing burned. On the way to the church, he lifted the child's paired shoes from the step and set them beside the altar, without ritual, because some acts insist on themselves despite the absence of witnesses. The shoes made no sound. The ledgers made a soft, domestic sigh when he opened the first page. Elias Morrow, present, wrote in the corner of his federal report as if a roll were being called and a man must stay here to keep himself from slipping out of count. The ash along the bank continued to lie there with a patience he could not match. Behind him, the church door shifted again and settled. He read the first line in the ledger, read it twice, and felt the word settle like silt. Catherine Baird, Clerk of Records, records faithfully until there are none left to record. The hand was calm. The ink had not yet faded. There were chairs overturned at supper somewhere behind him, and there would be no one to set them right before morning. If this chilling opening gripped you, subscribe for more real American horrors from forgotten parishes, and tell me in the comments what you would feel stepping into a town this silent. Morning broke slowly over Langridge, pale and sour as the inside of an old mouth. Mist clung to the bayou like a shroud refusing to lift. Elias Morrow waited by the church gate, the hem of his coat heavy with damp, watching two new figures disembark from a flat-bottomed skiff that had groaned its way upriver all night. The first was Dr. Nathaniel Keene, a thin physician from Baton Rouge whose spectacles caught the light like two small, suspicious moons. The second was Jonah Kessler, a military adjutant assigned to record the condition of any settlement in unusual distress. His boots were polished past reason, a soldier's way of imposing order on mud. They exchanged no greetings, only brief nods. The bayou made its own introductions, the buzz of invisible insects, the click of minnows, the slow exhale of something submerged. Elias pointed toward the parish boundary where the inverted crosses still hung. "That's where it begins," he said. "Or ends." They entered together. The deeper they walked, the thicker the air grew, humid, metallic, and holy, as if they were inhaling from the inside of a bell. Dr. Keene wiped his spectacles, muttering about malaria, though his eyes moved in small, anxious circuits, tracing shapes in the fog that refused to resolve. The smell was faintly sweet now, a perfume of corruption softened by distance. Jonah, for all his soldier's composure, kept one hand on his revolver. "If there are bodies, we bury them," he said. "If there's plague, we burn what's left." His voice didn't carry far, the air seemed to drink sound. They passed a pen of livestock, goats and a few cattle, nothing but bones and hides collapsed inward. The ribs gleamed through patches of rot, but no flies stitched the air above them. "Weeks dead," Keene said, kneeling to prod the ground. "But where are the carrion birds?" None circled overhead. The sky was colorless, its silence deeper than any noise. Every house's clock had stopped at midnight. Elias noticed first, then the others confirmed it, the long hands and the short hands both fused at 12. Some clocks still ticked faintly in protest, a slow choking rhythm that refused to die completely. It gave the impression that time itself had been executed and left hanging. In one parlor, they found plates still set for dinner. A pot of rice hardened to stone, meat turned gray, a prayer book folded neatly beside a bowl. Dr. Keene held a handkerchief to his face and whispered, "They knew." He didn't explain what he meant. As they advanced toward the town's heart, the smell changed. Not the sharpness of rot nor the animal sweetness of death, it was something sterile, human-made. "Lime," said Keene. He pointed to white residue along the steps of a general store, the porch swept clean except for that thin dusting of chalk. The smell burned their throats, that chemical tang used in plague houses and battlefields to cover what couldn't be confessed. Someone had poured it everywhere. "Deliberate," Elias murmured. This wasn't abandonment. It was erased. They found a trail of it leading through the central square where the flagpole leaned, rope gone, the flag dissolved to threads. Footprints marred the lime in places, bare feet, small ones, children perhaps, but ending abruptly as if the ground had swallowed the mid-step. Jonah's jaw tightened. "If they were burning bodies, we'd smell bone. This," he gestured to the whitened dirt, "this is a cover-up, not a burial." Dr. Keene crouched near a well. The bucket rope was freshly cut, its fray still clean. He peered into the dark shaft, tossed a pebble, and waited. No splash. "Dry," he said. "Or full of something that doesn't echo." By noon, the sun turned the mist into sweat. Their coats clung like damp rags. Elias led them toward the only building untouched by vines, the Church of St. Mildred, a gray structure that still seemed to breathe. The doors were flung wide as if in welcome or accusation. A single crow perched on the steeple, its wings ragged, head tilted. It did not move even when Jonah aimed a rock. Inside, the pews were perfectly aligned, as though waiting for a congregation that might return from sleep. Sunlight filtered through dust, catching on the suspended air where lime still floated like pollen. A crucifix hung above the altar, but Christ was missing. Only the nails remained, darkened with rust, or blood too old to name. On the altar lay a stack of parish ledgers, bound in cracked leather. Elias stepped forward first, brushing the topmost with his glove. Dr. Keene warned, "Don't touch," but the courier had already opened it. The ink had bled, but the handwriting was unmistakably the same through every entry: Catherine Baird, Clerk of Records. The pages were precise at first, births, tithes, attendance lists, but toward the middle they began to deform. Margins filled with scripture, the writing shrinking, words repeating, "Wash the flesh. We are weighed. The Lord counts by subtraction." At the final pages, the format returned to order. Neat columns, dated one after another, each a death certificate, signed by Catherine's own hand. Dozens, then hundreds. Some names appeared twice, once under birth and again under death, both written in the same hour. The final line. Baird, Catherine, deceased, April 18, 1846. Jonah exhaled. She signed her own. Elias felt the back of his neck prickle. Or someone used her hand. The physician leaned in closer, tracing the paper's edge. "No," he said softly. "The tremor's her own. Look at the way the ink fades at the loops, it's fatigue, not forgery." They turned another page. Beneath the record of her death, one final sentence scrawled diagonally across the margin: "All debts paid. The Lord requires no witnesses." A hollow sound drew their attention, something sliding beneath the floorboards. Jonah knelt, pressed his ear against the plank. "Air pocket," he said, "or crawl space." He pried a loose board with his knife, and the smell erupted: lime, wet wood, faint sweetness. Not corpses, but chemical decay, as if the building itself were decomposing from the inside. Dr. Keene stumbled back, coughing. They poured it under the floor. "To cleanse," Elias murmured, finishing the thought. "Or to hide." The lime wasn't scattered, it was measured. Buckets at precise intervals, poured through small drilled holes later plugged with wax. Someone had done this with purpose, as though sanitizing sin itself. Jonah closed the plank. "If this is holy work," he said, "then God's got an odd definition of purity." They searched the vestry. On a table lay a basin filled with cloudy water that hadn't evaporated despite the heat. Floating inside were broken communion wafers, swollen like blisters. Behind it, a hymn book was open to a verse underlined in thick black ink. "He shall cleanse the sanctuary from the uncleanness of the children of Israel, and hallow it." Dr. Keene ran his finger along the verse, whispering, "They thought they were hallowing." Elias noticed something else: the altar cloth folded neatly on a pew, stiff with dried lime. Underneath it, another smaller book, the Ledger of Tithes. Its last entry was a single name: Reverend Asa Langridge. No amount, no date, only a final word in the remarks column: returned. "Returned what?" Jonah asked. Elias shook his head. Or maybe he meant to return to him. The three men sat for a while in the church's center aisle, speaking little. Outside, the sound of cicadas began but never swelled, stuck in a thin mechanical rhythm, like time trying to start itself again. Dr. Keene broke the silence. "You know what this reminds me of? The St. Joseph fever, back in 31. The entire congregation walked into the river believing it would heal them. Half were found miles downstream, still holding their hymn books. But this," he gestured to the room, "this looks orderly. No panic. They followed instructions." Jonah stared up at the empty cross. "Then who gave them?" Elias had no answer. He only looked again at Catherine Baird's name, repeated across pages like a heartbeat that refused to stop even after death. They packed the ledgers carefully, wrapping them in cloth. Outside, the air had thickened again. The lime burned sharper now that the day had warmed. It mingled with the bayou's breath, a chemical psalm that clung to the back of the throat. From the far side of the square, a faint sound echoed, something metallic, rhythmic. They followed it cautiously until they saw the source, a windmill turning though there was no wind. Its blades creaked once, twice, then froze mid-rotation, pointing east, toward the swamp. Dr. Keene frowned. No breeze. Mechanical movement. Pressure change. Jonah unsheathed his revolver again. Maybe someone's still here. They waited. The mill didn't move again. Elias wrote his second report that evening on the courthouse table. His handwriting shook more than usual. Found the Church of St. Mildred. All parishioners recorded deceased by their own clerk. Cause undetermined. Lime applied throughout structures. Clock stopped at midnight. No trace of living soul. He signed his name and folded the paper. For a moment he thought he heard a whisper behind him, paper brushing paper, like ledgers turning themselves. He turned, but the room was empty except for dust and lime that glowed faintly in the candlelight, as if it remembered sunlight better than he did. Outside, the swamp hummed again, too steady to be nature, too hollow to be wind. Somewhere in the distance, a bell rang once. Then silence. The smell wasn't death. It was what came after death that tried to clean itself. And in that sterile, metallic air, they began to understand, whatever had happened in Langridge Parish was not an ending. It was the residue of something still working itself out, a faith turned inward, eating its own congregation in the name of purity. The ledgers weighed more than paper ought to weigh. Elias Morrow felt it in the tendons of his wrist when he lifted the first book from the altar, a heaviness that belonged to iron or rainwater, not to calfskin and ink. He carried it to the front pew and sat with the care of a penitent choosing a place to confess. Dr. Nathaniel Keene and Jonah Kessler took seats behind him, the three men arranged like consecutive thoughts, close enough to hear one another breathe, far enough to keep from sharing the same doubt. At first the pages were the familiar housekeeping of a parish convinced it would last forever, baptisms marked with a neat cross beside the infant's name, marriages paired like doves in a margin, tithes entered as a slender, steady trickle that fattened after harvest. Catherine Baird had a hand that believed the world could be made legible. Her capitals were honest, no ornament beyond what the letters demanded, her totals tight, her little loops closed as if to keep the numbers inside from slipping their pens. The first 6 years of Langridge lay in those opening leaves like panes of clean glass. You could look through and see the shape of a town, Martha Quince delivering her fourth child, Zebediah Rowe mending the mill wheel for credit, Ephraim Coyle forgiven his tithe during a fever month. It was all the work of people who expected tomorrow to take the same size as today. Then the pages began to lean. Not suddenly, at first, a column that did not quite meet the foot of the page, a date that nudged into the margin and asked to be excused, a repetition of a surname that had no business repeating there. Dr. Keene adjusted his spectacles until they squeaked against the bridge of his nose. There, he said softly, not pointing at any one thing but at the cumulative listlessness that had crept into the ink. Fatigue, or agitation. Jonah leaned forward. Agitation, he said. Fatigue leaves smudges. This leaves scratches. Elias turned another page. The year at the top, 1846, had been written once, then written again slightly darker, as if the first attempt had failed to convince the clerk that time had indeed advanced. The entries below fell into a new rhythm. Deaths multiplied, and then multiplied again, refusing to keep their distance from one another. What had been occasional punctuation became a stanza. The causes listed were tidy at first: ague, childbirth, drowning, each with a physician's countersignature. Then the causes went blank, a straight rule drawn beneath the name as if the clerk believed cause was a distraction from the fact. In the italics of a margin, Catherine had written, "The fever whispers scripture in the cookhouse at noon." The sentence wore the plain dress of an observation, but the words did not belong to household inventory. A page later, squeezed between candles, 6 dozen, and nails, 3 pounds, came an accounting that bent like heat above a field, debt remitted at the river. Children exempted by mercy. Elias slowed his turning as if the pages might bruise. He had carried record books on barges and mules and remembered how they passed through a clerk's hands in Baton Rouge, hands that trusted ink more than breath. Here, ink had begun to behave like breath, ragged in places, caught short in others. A list of burials ran for 10 lines, then stopped. Below it, a line struck through the word burial itself, as though the town had rejected the concept. Dr. Keene touched the strike with his forefinger and pulled back when a fine dust came away. Lime, he murmured. Pages dusted. Either to dry them fast or to keep them preserved. Jonah, restless, rose and went to the altar to fetch the next ledger, then another and another, until the stack dwindled to the width of a prayer. He set the books on the pew beside Elias. The last volumes had swelled at their edges where damp had tried to get in and had been refused by some stubborn force. He opened one at random. The year had folded back on itself. March contained 2 marches, the second written with apologetic parentheses, corrected March. Names reappeared, Agnes Fenn, Thomas Jett, Caleb Ward, as if the parish had attempted to die on schedule and then discovered the calendar did not consent. And then came her name, with a different gravity than the others. Baird, Catherine, deceased. No physician's countersignature followed, only a clean, decisive line in that same unadorned hand, recorded by C. Baird, clerk. A stillness fell in the pew as if a fourth person had sat down among them. Dr. Keene exhaled through his nose. She wrote herself into the ledger, he said. Either before the fact or after. After, Jonah said, too quickly. No one signs their own death while still able to hold a pen. Elias did not answer. He had delivered news to men who had known, before the wax cooled on the seal, what the content must be. A body can remain long enough to make a shape and then go, a hand can finish a sentence and then fail. He turned the page. The handwriting broke. The faithful sobriety of Catherine's script unraveled into a smaller hand, a hand that feared the width of the page. Words squeezed themselves together like bodies making room on a pew. The left margin disappeared. Scripture spilled, Leviticus, Hebrews, Revelation, but braided with words no pulpit would say, we are counted by subtraction, the swamp carries the sum. Under the column for deaths, someone, she, had begun to enter children first, as if racing after them in ink to catch what the fever or the river had already taken. The names were not unfamiliar to anyone who had read the earlier volumes. Sally Horn, age 5, who had been baptized with a ribbon in her hair, Micah Quince, age 8, who had delivered kindling to the preacher every Saturday. Alongside Micah's name, Catherine had drawn, not a cross, as was custom, but a small square, then shaded it in completely until the ink bled through. In the opposite margin, sealed. Dr. Keene put his head in his hands. I have seen cholera lists, he said to the floorboards. The writing fractures in panic. But this is a different break. This is, doctrine. Jonah closed the book softly, like a man laying a hand on a shoulder in passing. We'll camp in the courthouse, he said. Better walls. We can sort these by lamplight. They gathered the ledgers with the care of pallbearers and carried them up the lane. The afternoon wore itself thin. The air acquired the sting of copper coins held too long in a warm palm. They passed a row of clocks visible through parlor windows, all arrested at the same poised insistence, midnight, as though an unseen bailiff had called time and every machine had obeyed. A henhouse door stood open, inside, straw lay undisturbed, no sign of struggle, the eggs thick with dust the exact color of old milk. A tethered sow had settled to bone without the comfort of carrion. The visible world had proceeded to that specific point and then halted, like a breath held as a vow. The courthouse offered shelter of a sort, planked walls that remembered straightness, a roof that kept most of the sky outside. The great table in the center wore a film of lime that the men brushed aside with their sleeves. Elias set the ledgers in 2 deliberate stacks, before and after, the dividing line of his own invention, placed where the hand began to hesitate. He struck a match, lit the lamps, and for a moment the room took on a domestic warmth that felt dishonest. He blew out the match, the sulfur bite folded into the larger, unfamiliar odor that had threaded every building, sterile, assertive, almost hopeful, as if the town had laundered itself and hung its soul out to dry. They read. Night arranged itself around them, the way furniture rearranges in a house after a funeral. A wind should have come with it, Bayou nights carry their own small weathers, but what found them instead was pressure, a weight against the walls as if a large ear pressed there to hear what they would say. The shutters jutted once, a shrug. The lamps kept their small paragraphs of light. Elias took the third ledger and met the voice that had begun to speak between the lines. Bread counted. Salt counted. Candles counted. Mouths counted. The Lord has fewer. Do not let the children answer when the fever asks their names. We burned them before they could speak again. Dr. Keene raised his head sharply at that, as though someone had rapped the table. Read it, he said, though Elias already had. He read it again, and the words behaved the same way, no flinch, no apology. The sentence had been written in a hand practiced at receipts. The cruelty lay in the competence. Jonah stood. Floor, he said. What? Asked Elias. Listen. They waited. A long pause passed, a measure between bars. From beneath the floorboards came a sound like breathing contained, not the intake and release of a chest but the movement of air around an obstruction, a regimented flutter. It might have been the wind insinuating itself under the courthouse, except the air outside had no ambition. It might have been water eddying in the old drainage ditch, except the sound was dry. Jonah knelt and set his ear to a crack. There's space under us, he said. More than crawl space. A room. Elias took one of the lamps and crouched. The cracks between the planks showed black, no friendly gleam of damp earth. Trapdoor, he suggested. They searched like careful burglars, tapping with knuckles. The fourth board from the table's end answered with a hollow that was too hollow. Nails had been set, then pulled, then set again. Jonah fetched his knife. In the lamplight, the blade looked excessive. He worked it under the plank. The wood lifted reluctantly, and when it yielded, the air that escaped struck their faces with a compound odor, sulfur astringent as ash on a tongue, and beneath it the cloy of candle grease long cooled and reheated, sweet as a grievance. They did not lift the plank far. The light tooth combed the space below and caught a wall of white, not the chalk of lime dabbed at random, but poured, smoothed, even as if someone had crept down there on hands and knees with a trowel and conviction. The surface was pocked by stubs of wick blackened at the tips. Jonah swallowed. Candles set in lime, he said. Why? Purification, Dr. Keene replied, but the word sounded like he had borrowed it and was trying out its fit. Or sealing. In fever wards, they, burn tallow to keep the air. He didn't finish. The three men let the plank settle back into place. The room brightened slightly, as if the dark below had stolen a portion of their light. They returned to the ledgers with a chastened quiet. Elias turned a page and found a set of entries that had been recopied as if for presentation to a higher authority. The names were arranged alphabetically by household, every member accounted for. At each family's foot, a final line repeatable as liturgy, released from debt. The script steadied again here, as if rewriting had given Catherine back her hand. But the repetition ate at the margins. Released from debt. Released from debt. Released from debt. The clerk's assurance hardened into a hammer that struck each name equally, saint and drunkard, midwife and miller, child and old man. Religious contagion, Dr. Keene said at last, not to argue but to anchor the thought. A doctrine that eats its own logic. Guilt made technical. Jonah rubbed his forehead. And led by whom? The ledger did not answer, but the next page offered another voice, a record in the same hand, the same ink, but with lines that pressed deeper into the paper. It had been written with the nib held tighter, the way one holds a quill when copying an order delivered with a gun nearby. By decree of Reverend Asa Langridge, the congregation will be weighed and cleansed. No witness required. The Lord receives his accounts in full. No signature followed, only a small mark like a fishhook scratched in the corner. It might have been a private sign Catherine used when she meant to remember something and could not afford to write it plain. Wind, or what tried to be wind, moved the shutters. Somewhere, too far to be the church bell, a metallic note rang like a spoon tapped against a glass and then refused to be repeated. Elias realized his mouth had gone dry in a way water would not cure. They paused to eat from their haversacks, hard biscuit, a strip of pork that had the dignity to be worse than it looked. Food had no place in this room. It shamed the ledgers. Elias wrapped the remnants again and set them aside. The lamp chimneys wore a film of lime. He wiped one and watched the lamp burn truer, a ridiculous solace. You see it, don't you? Dr. Keene said suddenly, addressing no one and both of them. The shape of their proof. If you believe the swamp is a ledger, you keep your own to match it. You erase with lime what won't bear signing. You turn crosses upside down so the law of heaven will look down upon the law of earth and be satisfied that the latter is ashamed. Jonah's face behind the lamplight seemed older than it had that morning. And if a boy asks a question? Then, Keene said, you burn the question before it returns with an answer. From the margin of the page, Catherine spoke again, smaller this time, as if leaning in so close that the words had nowhere else to go. They will come from Baton Rouge and ask where the bodies are. Tell them the Lord keeps what bodies cannot. The letters thinned to hair at the end, the ink climbing uphill toward dryness. Elias let the page rest. Beyond the windows, the hymn began, not loud, not full, just the shape of a hymn, a line hummed without a melody, a rise and fall that suggested worship but contained no God. The men looked at one another and at the door without moving. Elias felt the trick his thoughts started to play. If there's a hymn, there are mouths. If there are mouths, there are bodies. But the sound did not come from the lane or the square. It came with the certainty of a floorboard's echo, from below. Jonah stood with the method of a man unlearning caution. I'll have a look, he said. We will, Elias corrected. In a town that had dismissed witnesses, the simple grammar of plurality felt like defiance. They lifted the plank again. The air from the cavity rose with more confidence this time, as though the space had been waiting for permission to speak. The lamp's light sank in and met the whiteness of lime, the black dental nubs of extinguished wicks, the glaze of hardened drips running toward a drain that wasn't there. And along the nearest rim, letters, a clumsy carving in the lime itself, fingernail deep, a woman's hand by the narrowness of the strokes. We burned them before they could speak again. Dr. Keene shut his eyes. Not a figure of speech, then, he said, as if the fact could be made smaller by being given its proper name. Not only doctrine. Jonah lowered the plank with a control he had not shown in any other motion that day. Seal it, he said, though nothing they did could add to what had been done. They returned to the table. There were still ledgers to read, and the work of reading had become its own ritual, its own refusal. Elias thought, as he turned the next page, of the quiet this town had engineered. A quiet so complete that even the dead refrained from the ordinary work of spoiling, a quiet limed and laundered and taught to sit. He set his pen to his federal report and wrote a sentence that understood its own futility. The records of Langridge Parish declare all debts settled and all lives accounted for, including the clerk's own. He paused, then added, the air smells of lime and wax. The hymn beneath them thinned, or else their courage thickened enough to hear it without flinching. Midnight was hours away, but the stopped clocks had made night permanent, and time obeyed. Before they closed the last ledger for the evening, Elias found one more entry departing from the rest. No names, no amounts, only a date and a line. Saturday, River turned back as if ashamed. Asa to preach. The name Asa stood there with the brazenness of a nail hammered too far and bent over, unremovable without tearing the board. Reverend Asa Langridge, founder of the parish, would get his sermon the way some men get their verdict. Elias blew out one lamp and then another. Darkness collected the room into a single figure. The hymn faded. Lime settled. Under the table, a cricket tried one bar of its own song and abandoned it. The three men lay on the courthouse floor with coats for pillows, their shoulders parallel to the seam where the plank had been lifted, as if sleep might learn from geometry how to stay straight. The last thing Elias saw before closing his eyes was the faint phosphor of lime along the ledger edges, pages that had been cleaned as if for burial and yet refused to be buried. In the morning, they would go to the church again, not for comfort but for prosecution. They would open the pulpit and find what pulpits hide when a sermon tears its own throat. For now, the ledgers lay closed and seemed to breathe. Morning came to Langridge Parish without sound. The sun rose but made no effort to shine, it only revealed more clearly the dust suspended in the air, turning light into something one could taste. The three men, Elias Morrow, Dr. Nathaniel Keene, and Jonah Kessler, stood outside the courthouse with the unease of those who had read too much and slept too little. Elias had the ledgers bundled in his arms, their weight unreasonable, as though the books themselves contained the remains they could not find. He looked toward the church of St. Mildred, and the structure seemed to have changed overnight. The wood had darkened, as if it had drawn the night into its grain and now refused to let it go. Jonah broke the stillness first. We've read enough of Catherine's handwriting, he said. Now I want to hear the man who made her write it. They crossed the square slowly. The lime dust, stirred by their boots, rose in pale clouds that drifted around their legs like reluctant spirits. The air carried that same metallic tang, but now there was something else beneath it, an odor faintly sweet, faintly wrong, like flowers boiled too long in sugar water. The church doors were still open. A crow had nested above the lintel overnight. When Jonah stepped across the threshold, it gave a single cry and flew into the swamp, leaving one black feather to settle at his feet. Inside, the air had curdled. The men paused just inside the nave, unwilling to disturb the arrangement of pews that still faced the pulpit in rigid alignment. The floor bore faint scuff marks, circles drawn in lime dust, like outlines of knees pressed during some fevered prayer. On the pulpit lay a single open book. Not a Bible, as they expected, but a sermon diary, hand-bound, its cover cracked, the ink inside brown and thin as rust water. Elias read aloud the first lines, delivered by Reverend Asa Langridge, Feast of St. Mildred, April 12, 1846. The flesh must confess before it can ascend. The swamp remembers what the ground denies. Dr. Keene, squinting over his shoulder, whispered, he wrote like a man already half inside his own grave. Jonah pointed toward the back wall, where faint streaks of soot climbed upward from the floorboards to the rafters. The marks had a deliberate pattern, vertical lines spaced evenly, blackened to the same height, as if candles had burned there in regimented rows. Each streak ended at about the level of a kneeling man's head. Standing congregation. Jonah murmured. No. These were floor candles. Dr. Keene crouched, brushing the boards with his fingers. Not wax, he said. Tallow. Human, perhaps. It has that weight to it. No one replied. The air had thickened to the point that words seemed impolite. Elias turned another page of the sermon diary. The Lord does not delight in numbers. He requires the weight of obedience. One soul in rebellion can outweigh 100 in prayer. And below it, a later entry written in a smaller, more frantic hand. Catherine records faithfully. She will be my tongue when the fever blinds me. If they cry in the water, it is not pain, it is the hymn of cleansing. Elias's voice caught on that word, cleansing, and he closed the book as if to trap it inside. Dr. Keene looked toward the pulpit floor, his gaze drawn to a seam barely visible where two boards met. Do you see it? He asked. Jonah already had his knife out. Another hatch, he said. They pried it open, and what rose from the dark was not a smell but a temperature, a warmth that had no business surviving beneath cool morning boards. The lamplight fell into the cavity and found the things the Reverend had left behind. Jars of blackened holy water, sealed with wax and ash. A crucifix with its figure eroded smooth, as if by repeated handling. A child's rosary, the beads fused together by heat. And beneath them all, a shallow pit lined with soot and char. Jonah turned away. He burned them, he said. Not as an execution, ritual. Like he was offering them. Dr. Keene's lips trembled around a sentence he didn't finish. In plague houses, they'd burn bedding, clothes, anything touched by the sick. But this was a sermon. Elias lifted one of the jars. The liquid inside was the color of tea left to spoil. A sliver of something pale floated within, bone or wax or both. The label, smeared but legible, read, for the second baptism. He set it down carefully. He baptized them again, he said, until there was nothing left to baptize. They searched the vestry next. The walls were lined with nailed-up sheets of scripture, verses copied over one another until the paper turned gray from ink and moisture. A few had peeled away, revealing new handwriting beneath, Catherine's, finer and more deliberate. He preaches through me now, one page read. He says the Lord counts only the obedient. The rest are numbers without souls. Jonah tore one page free, only to reveal another beneath it, written directly onto the wood itself. We drank and called it mercy. The three men stood in silence. Outside, the swamp hissed like a living thing, reeds shifting without wind. Then the bell above them groaned, a single, heavy swing, the clapper dragging across bronze. It didn't ring properly, it scraped, metal on metal, the sound of exhaustion rather than warning. Dr. Keene flinched. That wasn't the wind, he said. Jonah climbed the narrow ladder to the belfry. The others heard his boots on the rungs, each creak slower than the last. He stopped halfway up. There's something here, he called down. Something hanging. He climbed the rest, then cursed under his breath. It's not bodies, he said. It's clothes, robes, parishioners' garments. strung from the beam like trophies. He descended quickly, face pale. They hung their own robes after the sermon, he said. Every one of them. Elias looked toward the altar again, to the ledgers they had found before. And then Catherine wrote the records, he said softly. One by one, as he told her to. The air grew thicker still. A faint hum seemed to rise from the floor, too low to be wind, too constant to be an illusion. Dr. Keene pressed a hand to his chest. Do you feel that? He asked. Elias nodded. Like a heartbeat. The hum deepened until it was not sound but pressure, as though the earth beneath the church was breathing inward. From somewhere below came a subtle splash, the weight of liquid shifting. Jonah crouched near the pulpit seam again. The pit's moving, he said. Listen. They knelt, and through the crack came the faint burble of water, though none should have been there. Elias whispered, the bayou's underneath us. Dr. Keene shook his head. The water table's lower than this. That's not natural seepage. A faint glow appeared from within the pit, pulsing with the rhythm of breath. It was not firelight, nor reflection, but something duller, phosphorescence, the residue of rot. Elias forced himself to look. It's their candles, he said. Still burning. And indeed, below the lime and the ash, faint wicks smoldered in a wax that never melted completely, feeding on some unholy mixture of tallow and swamp gas. When the glow faded, they replaced the pulpit boards and stepped outside. The day had turned gray again, no hour felt like noon or morning. At the church's threshold, Elias looked back once more. The altar seemed smaller now, as though receding into the dark. He preached them to death, he said. Dr. Keene adjusted his glasses with trembling fingers. No, he murmured. He preached them into silence. Jonah spat into the mud. And Catherine recorded it as salvation. They walked toward the courthouse in wordless agreement. Behind them, the church bell gave a final, weary sigh, one last exhalation of metal, and the echo of it lingered in the fog like the closing breath of a prayer too heavy to reach heaven. That night, the three men camped again among the ledgers. Outside, rain began to fall in thin sheets, tapping the shutters like knuckles against a coffin lid. Elias could not sleep. He took up the preacher's diary and read the last page again by lamplight. It was dated the same day every clock had stopped. The fever has chosen its saints. When the water rises, we will be lighter than our sins. The Lord will see us float. The ink trailed off into a line that carved deep into the paper, as though the hand had pressed harder than it meant to before ceasing entirely. Elias closed the diary and whispered, "Float where?" No one answered. The rain kept time against the roof, and beneath it, in the distance, the swamp made a sound like a congregation turning in unison, waiting for the next sermon to begin. The storm that night did not move like any natural weather Elias Morrow had known. It came without thunder, without lightning, only pressure, the kind that made the ears hum and the lungs mistake breath for guilt. Rain fell not in sheets but in separate, deliberate drops, as though the sky itself was counting each one. Inside the courthouse, the three men, Elias, Dr. Nathaniel Keene, and Jonah Kessler, sat among the ledgers with their lanterns trimmed low. The smell of lime had thickened under the wet air, crawling through every crack of the wooden floor. It mingled with candle smoke and something new, a sweetness that wasn't there before. Not floral, not pleasant. Sweet like spoiled fruit. Sweet like blood left too long to think about itself. Jonah was the first to speak. "I can't stand this silence anymore," he said, his voice hoarse. "It's like the town's listening." Dr. Keene gave a brittle laugh. "Maybe it is. Collective madness leaves echoes." Elias looked at the ledgers spread before them. "Or records," he said. "Echoes written down until they believe themselves real." He opened the preacher's diary again, the last sermon of Reverend Asa Langridge, and read by the unsteady light. "Confession is the river. All who drink it will know peace. The flesh must be lightened by admission." Below that line, in Catherine Baird's smaller, tidier hand, she had copied a list of names, hundreds, each followed by a single word, confessed. It was near midnight when the first sound came. A rhythmic creak, faint but constant, from the direction of the church. Jonah froze mid-sentence. "That's the bell rope," he whispered. Elias frowned. "There's no rope." The sound came again, creak, pause, creak, like breath passing through wood. They stared at each other for a moment before Jonah grabbed his lamp. "We're not waiting for it to come to us." Dr. Keene hesitated. "What if it's wind?" "There hasn't been wind in this place since we arrived." They left the courthouse and stepped into the storm's breathless heart. The rain had stopped. The streets glistened as though freshly varnished. The air shimmered with humidity so thick it seemed visible, like walking through breath itself. When they reached the church, the sound had stopped. The door stood ajar, its hinges dripping with condensation. Jonah entered first, revolver drawn. The pews were still aligned, the altar bare. But on the pulpit, 3 new sheets of parchment rested, damp but legible. Each bore a name. Elias Morrow. Dr. Nathaniel Keene. Jonah Kessler. Below each name, the same phrase, confessed. Dr. Keene's voice cracked. "That wasn't here this morning." Elias touched the paper. It was warm. From the rafters came a drop, a soft, deliberate tap on the wood between them. Another. Then another. The rain hadn't stopped at all, it was falling inside the church. Jonah raised his lamp toward the ceiling. The wood was slick, dark, not from water but from soot, as if something had been burned above the rafters. As the light touched it, a shape moved. A robe. Then another. Then dozens. They swung gently, still tethered to beams, turning in invisible wind. The robes were empty, but each one leaked, a slow drip of black water that fell like confession itself. Dr. Keene stumbled backward, clutching his chest. "It's the fever," he gasped. "Airborne. Spores, maybe." "No," Elias said, eyes fixed on the pulpit. "It's a memory." The papers on the pulpit began to curl at their edges. The ink bled. For an instant, it looked wet, freshly written. "Who's writing this?" Jonah demanded. The bell rang once. Not loud, but deep. A sound from the marrow of the earth. The church floor shuddered. The lime that had been poured beneath the boards now cracked, releasing a hiss that carried the smell of sulfur and decay. They heard it before they saw it, a slow rising boil from the pit under the pulpit. The lime was dissolving, reacting, burning itself clean again. Elias grabbed the preacher's diary from his coat. "He wrote about this," he said, flipping through pages that seemed to know exactly where to stop. He read aloud, "When the hour of confession comes, the river will breathe again. The ground will open and remember its children." Jonah shouted, "That's not a metaphor, Elias." The boards beneath them flexed. Steam rose in thin, disciplined ribbons. Dr. Keene backed toward the door, his face white as chalk. "We need to leave," he said, but the door refused to open. The wood had swollen shut. Then came the sound, faint at first, then clearer, the hymn. It wasn't music. It breathed through many throats, exhaling the same word in rhythm, confess. 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 Elias dropped to his knees, pressing his ear to the floor. Beneath the boards, voices shifted like water, rising and falling, layered in impossible harmony. Male, female, child, it was all the same voice now. Dr. Keene crossed himself with shaking fingers. "It's the congregation," he said. "Their lungs are gone, but their air remains." Jonah fired his revolver once into the floor. The sound cracked through the church, the flash lighting a brief, blinding image of what lay beneath, faces in the lime, blurred but present, mouths open as though still singing. The bullet left no mark. The lime closed around it as if swallowing the sin whole. Elias stood slowly. "They didn't die," he said. "They believed they were purifying themselves. Every one of them went under willingly." Dr. Keene's voice was nearly a whisper. "Then who finished the record?" Elias looked down at the pulpit again. The 3 papers bearing their names had dried now, crisp and final. He picked one up, his own, and found a new line written beneath, "Witnessed by Catherine Baird." Jonah took his lamp to the pulpit. Behind it, against the wall, he saw a mark etched into the wood, a fishhook scratched deep. The same symbol Catherine had used to mark her private entries. "She's still here," Jonah muttered. The bell rang again, louder this time. It didn't swing, it screamed, the sound pushing through their bones like pressure from the swamp. The hymn below grew frantic, the syllables losing coherence, turning to a roar of air and wet throats. Then, all at once, it stopped. The silence that followed was total. When they finally forced the door open, the night had changed color. The rain was red-brown from the clay. The swamp beyond the parish shimmered as though lit from underneath, small ripples spreading outward in perfect circles. Dr. Keene bent double and vomited into the mud. Jonah stared at the horizon, his face unreadable. Elias simply held the diary to his chest and whispered, "We're not here to document. We're here to replace them." Jonah turned sharply. "Don't start that." But Elias only pointed back at the church. The pulpit window glowed faintly from within, not firelight, not lamp, but phosphorescence, like the light under a stagnant pond. "It's their confession," Elias said. "Still burning." The rain began again, thin, even, measured. Each drop struck the mud with the same rhythm the hymn had used. Confess. 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 If you found yourself standing in that church, alone, the air thick with the smell of lime and the sound of the dead confessing, what would you have done? Would you have listened, or joined them? Tell me in the comments below. And make sure you're subscribed for the next descent into real American horror. By dawn, the rain had thinned into mist again, and the bayou's reflection looked like a bruised sky laid face down. Langridge Parish slept the way corpses sleep, without beginning, without end. The three men did not. They sat inside the courthouse, wet and wordless, staring at the ledgers that refused to stay closed. Elias Morrow held the preacher's diary like a wound he couldn't stop touching. His fingers left faint prints on the cover, salt from his own sweat marking the leather like small, invisible confessions. Dr. Nathaniel Keene shivered in silence, though the air was heavy and hot. Jonah Kessler cleaned his revolver with the discipline of someone doing arithmetic to keep the mind from thinking. The smell of lime had dulled overnight into something else, old parchment, river mud, and the faint copper taste of air that has recently held a prayer too long. Elias was the first to speak. His voice was the sound of a match striking a stone. "We didn't escape that church," he said. "We were dismissed." Dr. Keene looked up, his glasses fogged. "Dismissed from what?" "From the sermon," Elias said. "From their ritual. We're the witnesses they left behind to finish the record." Jonah snorted. "No one left us any records to finish." Elias pointed at the ledgers. The top one lay open again, though no one remembered opening it. Its last page was blank save for a single word written in fine, decisive script. "Continue." Dr. Keene stared at the ink. "Catherine's hand," he said softly. Jonah slammed the book shut, but the sound had no conviction, it was like clapping in fog. "Let's leave," Keene said. "Take the boat, file our report, burn whatever's left of this place." Elias didn't answer. His eyes were fixed on something just beyond the courthouse window, the steeple of St. Mildred's, visible through the thinning mist. From its crossbeam hung the bell, blackened from age. It should have been still. Yet it swayed gently, side to side, moved by no wind. By mid-morning, the mist had cleared enough for the sunlight to find them. It came in hard, white angles through the window slats, cutting the room into strips. Each strip of light looked like paper unrolled across the floor. Elias noticed something in that light, tiny motes drifting down, white and slow. Lime dust. Falling from the ceiling. Jonah looked up, revolver half raised. Above us? Elias climbed onto the table. The boards overhead had warped. Between them, fine powder sifted down like a second snowfall. He pried one loose and looked inside. There, pressed flat against the underside of the roof, were parchment sheets, hundreds, pasted in layers so thick they formed a second ceiling. He tore one free. The ink had run but the words were legible. It was the same handwriting. Catherine's. "The fever forgave us. The federal men will come to sign what we cannot." Elias dropped the sheet. It drifted down like a slow feather. Dr. Keene whispered, "Federal men. That's us." Jonah holstered his weapon with shaking hands. "We're leaving. Right now." But the air had begun to move. Not the way wind moves, it had intent. It gathered in the corners first, curling upward, taking the dust with it. The lamps flickered, their flames bending toward the ledgers as though drawn by a breath. Elias turned toward the table. The books had opened themselves. Pages turned one by one, their sound soft and deliberate, like someone walking down a hall in bare feet. Dr. Keene backed toward the door. "This isn't possible," he whispered. "No draft can." The top ledger stopped turning. Its last page fluttered once, then settled. On it, a new line appeared. Ink formed letter by letter, the way frost forms on glass. Morrow, Elias, deceased, June 9, 1846. The date was today. Jonah lunged forward, slammed the book shut, and shoved Elias toward the exit. "We're done here," he hissed. "Whatever's left, it wants your name." Elias didn't move. His eyes were fixed on the ink, still glistening. "It already has it." Dr. Keene threw open the door. Sunlight poured in like redemption offered too late. "Move." They stepped outside. The air was bright, cruelly bright, washing the world clean in colorless light. The parish lay quiet. No birds. No insects. The swamp's water looked still enough to hold a reflection, but there were none. The men's faces did not appear on the surface. Elias felt the heat rise under his collar. "Something's changed," he said. "Everything's changed," Jonah muttered. "We're the only things breathing in a place that stopped." But Dr. Keene wasn't listening. He was staring at the courthouse door behind them. It had shut on its own. And from inside came the unmistakable sound of a pen scratching paper. They ran to the dock. The skiff they had used days before was still tied there, half sunk but seaworthy enough for desperation. The river smelled wrong, like soap and sickness, but Jonah didn't care. He untied the line, grabbed an oar, and pushed off. "Row," he barked. Dr. Keene rowed, his hands trembling so violently the oar splashed more than it moved. The current was slow, too slow. The water resisted as though it thickened. Halfway across, Elias looked back. The town was vanishing. Not burning, not sinking, erasing. Buildings lost definition, outlines fading as if sketched in chalk and wiped away. The steeple was the last to go, the bell's black curve still visible even as the rest dissolved into brightness. Then the river grew perfectly still. Jonah stopped rowing. "We're out," he said. "It's done." Dr. Keene slumped forward, gasping. "God help us." Elias looked down at the water. The surface, though calm, rippled faintly with heat. Beneath it, something glowed. Hundreds of small, steady lights, candles, burning underwater. He whispered, "They're still praying." When the skiff reached the far bank, the men climbed out wordlessly. The earth felt soft beneath their boots, almost hollow. The trees on this side were coated with a thin layer of ash, as if Langridge's breath had followed them across. Jonah turned to Elias. "You're going to burn those ledgers, right?" Elias didn't answer. His satchel hung heavy at his side. Dr. Keene stared at him. "Elias, you didn't bring them." Elias blinked, confused, then looked down. The satchel's flap was open, empty. Behind them, in the middle of the river, a sound broke the quiet, the slow, deliberate toll of a bell. One. Then another. Then silence. Days later, federal rescuers arrived at the dock. They found the skiff tied neatly to the post, its hull coated in a white film of lime. Inside it lay 3 ledgers, dry despite the rain, stacked with unnatural precision. Each bore the same last entry, written in identical hands. Morrow, Elias, deceased. Keene, Nathaniel, deceased. Kessler, Jonah, deceased. And beneath, a 4th line appeared, freshly written. Baird, Catherine, witnessed. Some months later, a clerk in Baton Rouge catalogued the Langridge files. He noted that the ink on every page remained wet to the touch, even when sealed. He filed the ledgers away, wiped his fingers, and swore he could still smell lime and candle grease on his hands. When he looked at his own desk ledger later that week, he found a new entry written in fine, decisive script. Filed by, his name. Witnessed by Catherine Baird. He tried to erase it. The ink bled through the page, spreading like water through cloth, until it covered his hand entirely. The clerk's report was never submitted. His office remained empty, chair overturned, a single quill left resting across an open book. The page beneath it read simply: "All debts paid. No survivors left to sign." If you've stayed until this last breath of Langridge Parish, subscribe now for more true macabre tales that history buried, and tell me in the comments, do you believe a record can haunt, or that guilt itself learns to write? When the reports finally reached Baton Rouge, no one believed them. The envelope had arrived sealed in wax without a return signature, yet marked with an old federal emblem that had been retired years before. The paper inside was clean, uncreased, but smelled faintly of ash and wet parchment, the unmistakable odor of Langridge Parish that no survivor had lived long enough to describe. The first clerk who opened it, William Morrow, age 36, was a man of order. He had filed train accidents, quarantine lists, floods, and deaths that made no room for superstition. But the Langridge file behaved differently. The ink never dried. His fingertips came away black, even after blotting. He wiped them on his vest, and the stains bloomed again within the hour. Inside the envelope were 3 ledgers and a final parchment sheet. Each ledger was identical, each written in the same narrow hand, Catherine Baird's, and each ending with the same 4 names. Morrow, Elias, deceased. Keene, Nathaniel, deceased. Kessler, Jonah, deceased. Witnessed by Catherine Baird. The 4th ledger, the one that hadn't been sent by the men but appeared alongside their files, bore a 5th line. Rowe, William, pending. He thought it a joke, a bureaucratic prank from some overworked agent. But that night, long after the lamps had been extinguished and the insects had taken over the silence, he awoke to the sound of a bell. One slow toll. Then another. And a third that sounded like the groan of something remembering how to breathe. Days passed. The Baton Rouge office emptied as yellow fever crept upriver, and Rowe remained, unwilling to abandon what he now called his records. He told himself the entries needed verifying. But each morning when he arrived at his desk, the ledgers had rearranged themselves. Names shifted order. Dates corrected their handwriting. Margins filled with notes in a tone that was not his. He began to see patterns, repeated phrases in a clerical shorthand, sentences that sounded more like prayer than record. The debt is circular. The hand that writes cannot refuse its own name. Record what has already been decided. Rowe tried to burn one of the books. The paper resisted. It smoked but never curled. The ink steamed and then returned to black, unaltered, unbothered. He doused it with kerosene, the flame hissed like breath through teeth and went out. That evening, he found a new entry written on his own desk blotter, though no pen had touched it. The witness continues. Word of the Langridge record spread quietly, the way mold spreads under paint. A few inspectors volunteered to re-examine the parish site. The riverboat Pelican carried them down the bayou one early spring morning. They never arrived. The pilot claimed the current turned itself around midway, flowing upriver for an hour before calming again. When the boat docked at St. Martinville, the only thing left in the hold was a bundle of papers tied in wet string. The ledgers. Again. Federal archives absorbed the files, recatalogued them, and then lost them. Twice. Each time, they were found reappearing in a different department, shelved beneath irrelevant subjects, once under census, once under agriculture, and once, inexplicably, under marriage licenses. Every copy contained the same final line added in fresh ink: all debts are balanced. No signatures outstanding. Years later, survivors of the fever told stories of a ghost parish glimpsed through swamp fog. Some said they saw the faint lights of a church, burning candles under the water. Others swore they heard the toll of a bell just before the bayou turned silent. Those who went looking returned with lime dust on their boots, though there was no lime quarry within 50 miles. One fisherman, interviewed in 1882, described finding a child's shoe caught in a root cluster near Bayou Teche. Inside it, a slip of paper written in delicate 19th-century cursive: the clerk keeps the names. The water keeps the rest. No one traced the origin. No one dared. In 1891, a historian named Edmund Lane requested access to the Langridge files for a census study. He wrote in his notes, "There are 4 ledgers in the archive, but every catalogue I consult lists 5. He described the handwriting as tidy but unrepentant, and ended his report with a question that never found an answer: if Catherine Baird wrote every death, who wrote hers? Lane's report was discovered in 1904, sealed inside a drawer that had been nailed shut. At the bottom of the last page, written in darker ink, appeared a short paragraph clearly not in his hand. Clerk's record. Witnesses inherit. The weight passes forward. Every name must be signed. And beneath that, a fifth ledger reference number had been added in an unfamiliar notation, LP 0005, yet no such record ever existed in the archives. Time dulled the fever of curiosity. Langridge Parish slipped into the same obscurity that consumes all things too heavy to remember and too dangerous to forget. The bayou reclaimed its land, the church, if it had ever truly been there, sank beneath silt and whisper. But once each year, on the anniversary of the flood that erased the town, the Baton Rouge Archives receives an unmarked envelope. Inside, a single sheet of parchment, folded 3 times, perfectly dry. The handwriting, delicate and consistent, reads only, "Witnessed again." Each sheet is filed under Langridge, each dated in the same ink, each added to the same growing folder. No one signs the receipt, though every form bears a signature line already filled in. Catherine Baird. And so the Langridge Parish Purge remains a matter of record, though not of explanation. The swamp holds its breath, the ledgers keep their ink wet, and the bell, if one listens close enough on quiet nights, still tolls beneath the water where the church once stood. The inscription on the last surviving ledger, etched into its spine by a hand long gone, is short enough to be a commandment. All debts paid. No survivors left to sign. If this story haunted you, if the silence of Langridge Parish lingered long after the words ended, subscribe now for more true macabre tales from America's forgotten corners. And tell me, in the comments, when history leaves a blank space for your name, would you sign it?